The street in Larkspur Crossing had gone quiet in the way streets go quiet right before something breaks, and Lavinia Holloway felt that quiet settle into her bones as she stepped out of Merrow's general store with a rifle already rising to her shoulder. Cole Rourke sat his horse in the middle of the rutted road, a folded paper in one gloved hand, and behind him her brother Peter stood pinned against the water trough with his hands lifted and his face gone the color of old ash. "You are going to put that paper down and ride out of this crossing," Lavinia said, and her voice did not shake, though her hands wanted to. "This here is a lawful notice, Miss Holloway." Rourke's grin showed a gap where a tooth used to be. "Wanted for the theft of 6 Army remounts off the picket line at Fort Fetterman. Says right here, Peter Holloway, 19 years of age, last seen this district. I am simply here to collect what is owed the law. He was cutting hay on our own section the night those horses went missing, and half of Larkspur Crossing can swear to it." "Then half of Larkspur Crossing had best come swear it to a judge, because I am not paid to listen to a woman argue with a paper that has the Army seal on it." That was when the second hammer of a rifle clicked from the opposite end of the street, and every head turned to see a broad-shouldered man standing in the wide doorway of the blacksmith shop, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a heavy Henry rifle leveled steady as a fence post. "You heard the lady," Reuben Chandler said. "Put the paper away, Rourke, and get that horse turned around before I decide your business here is finished for good." Rourke's grin slid sideways, uncertain now, caught between 2 barrels aimed from 2 directions by 2 people who did not know each other and had not planned a thing between them. And for one long breath nobody in Larkspur Crossing moved, not the mule tied at the rail, not the old dog under the porch of the store, not the dust settling gold and slow in the low autumn sun. "This is Army business," Rourke tried again, though weaker now. "Then the Army can come collect the boy itself, with a proper officer and proper papers signed by somebody other than a bounty man working for Silas Gantry," Reuben said. "I have shot enough of Gantry's horses to know his hand in a piece of paper when I see it, and that notice was drawn up by somebody who has never set foot inside Fort Fetterman's provost office. You are calling me a liar in front of the whole street. I am calling you smart enough to climb back onto that animal and ride before this street decides for you." Rourke looked once more at Lavinia, whose rifle had not wavered though her arms had begun to ache with the weight of it, and once more at Reuben, whose stillness was worse than shouting, and he must have done the arithmetic that mattered, because he folded the paper back into his coat, spat into the dust near Peter's boot, and turned his horse west toward the gantry spread without another word. Nobody breathed easy until the sound of hooves had faded past the last fence post. Peter's legs gave out and he sat down hard on the edge of the trough, and Lavinia was across the street in 3 strides, her rifle forgotten against her hip, her hands on her brother's face checking for blows that had not landed. "I am all right, Vinnie," Peter said, using the name he had called her since he was small enough to ride on her shoulders across the ship's deck coming over from Bristol. "He only shouted. He did not touch me." "He would have taken you," she said, and her voice cracked at last now that the danger had passed, now that there was room for the fear to catch up with her. "He would have put you on that horse and ridden you off toward some judge who has never heard our name, all on a piece of paper Silas Gantry likely wrote himself at his own kitchen table. Ma'am." The blacksmith had come down off his porch, rifle now resting easy in the crook of his arm, and up close he was younger than she had thought from across the street, sun-marked and dark-haired, with a scar through one eyebrow that gave his face a look of having already survived whatever came next. "Reuben Chandler. I keep the forge here at the crossing. I know who you are, Mr. Chandler. My brother has spoken of you. He says you let him watch you set a wagon tire once and never charged him a cent for the lesson. He is a fair hand with tools, wasted, learning it from watching when he could be doing." Reuben's eyes moved past her to Peter, still sitting on the trough edge, breathing hard. "That paper Rourke was waving. You are certain your brother was home the night those horses went missing?" "I am certain because I was awake with him until past midnight, mending a harness by lamplight, and he never left the barn. Then somebody wrote a lie and put a government seal near it to make it look true. Reuben's jaw tightened, and something moved behind his eyes that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but shared a border with both. I have seen that trick worked on a family before. I did not stop it in time then. I do not intend to watch it happen twice. Lavinia studied him, this stranger who had drawn a rifle for a family he had never spoken a full sentence to, and she felt the particular unsteadiness of gratitude towards someone whose reasons she did not yet understand. Why would you put yourself between us and a man like Rourke, Mr. Chandler? You do not know us. I know a lie when a lie is standing in the street wearing a badge it was not issued, he said simply. And I know Gantry has had his eye on your section since the spring, on account of the spring that runs through it being the only reliable water between here and the Fort Road crossing at Deer Creek. A man does not send a bounty rider after a 19-year-old boy over 6 horses unless the horses are only half the reason. It was the first time anyone had said aloud what Lavinia had suspected in the quiet hours before dawn for weeks, and hearing it spoken plain by a man she had met 3 minutes ago settled something cold and certain in her stomach. Then, we had better find out the other half, she said. Reuben looked at her a long moment, at the steadiness that had returned to her hands, at the rifle she had not once let touch the ground even while comforting her brother, and something in his chest that had been locked shut for 3 years creaked open half an inch, though he would not have named it yet even to himself. You had better come into the shop, he said. Both of you. I have coffee and I have questions, and I expect you have a few of your own for me. The forge of Larkspur Crossing sat at the crook, where the military road bent north toward Fort Fetterman. 40-some miles of hard-packed dirt and river crossings between the crossing and the fort. Another 50 south and east back to Fort Laramie. And every wagon, every cavalry detail, every family racing to beat the first hard snow of late autumn passed within sight of Reuben Chandler's anvil. He had built the shop with his own hands 3 years before, laid the stone forge bed himself, and in that time had shod more horses and mended more wagon tongues than he could count, and had spoken to almost nobody about why a man who had once guided 40 wagons across 600 miles of open country had traded the trail for 4 walls and a bellows. Lavinia sat now on an overturned nail keg inside that shop, a tin cup of coffee warming her hands, while Peter examined a half-finished horseshoe with the frank curiosity of a boy who had always wanted to understand how things were made. "Tell me about your land," Reuben said, settling onto his own stool across the cold side of the forge. "All of it. How you came to hold it, what Gantry has said to you directly, everything." "My father brought us from England 8 years ago," Lavinia said. "Bristol before that. He had heard the land here was there for the taking if a body was willing to work it, and God knows we were willing. He and my mother filed the claim the first autumn, built the cabin themselves, dug the well by hand. My mother died of the fever 2 winters after we arrived. My father held the claim alone with Peter and me, until a rattlesnake spooked his horse 2 summers back, and he was thrown against the well stones." She said it plainly, without asking for pity, though Reuben heard the old grief under the words the way a man hears a crack running through good iron before it breaks. "So, it is only the 2 of you holding a homestead claim that requires continuous residence and improvement to keep clear title," Reuben said slowly. "And if the man of the household is removed from the property, arrested, taken away for trial in a territory where the nearest circuit judge sits 4 months out of the year, and the nearest jail is 100 miles distant, then I am a woman alone on a claim, and there are men in this territory, Mr. Chandler, who believe a woman alone on a claim is a claim already halfway abandoned. Gantry has said as much to you. Gantry has said worse than that." Lavinia's fingers tightened around the tin cup. "He came to our fence line in September before the first frost, and told me that a woman without a man to work land does not deserve to hold it, and that he would be glad to relieve me of the burden at a fair price. though the price he offered would not have bought new boots for Peter, let alone a new start somewhere east. When I told him no, he smiled and said the territory had a way of solving problems like mine without needing my consent. And now your brother is wanted for a crime he did not commit, on a notice written by a man who has never once ridden the 40 miles to Fort Fetterman to file it properly. You keep coming back to that, Peter said, looking up from the horseshoe. How can you be so certain the notice is false, Mr. Chandler? You have not seen the fort's own record of it. Because I have, Reuben said, and something in his voice went flat and careful, the tone of a man walking around the edge of an old wound. I ride to Fetterman every month to deliver iron and collect scrap for the forge. I was there 11 days ago when the quartermaster reported the missing remounts. He named no suspect. He said only that the horses had likely strayed or been taken by raiders working the Powder River country, and that a patrol would be sent looking come first light. There was no notice with your brother's name on it posted anywhere in that fort 11 days ago, because I read every board in the place, out of habit. Then somebody printed that notice after the fact, Lavinia said, and gave it to Rourke to carry, knowing full well it would never survive a real army inquiry, but knowing it would survive long enough to frighten a woman into selling her land before anyone thought to check. That is my reading of it, yes. Then we have to prove it, Peter said, setting down the horseshoe with sudden fierce energy. We have to ride to the fort and show them the notice is a forgery. We will, Reuben said, but not today and not alone. Gantry has men riding this stretch of road who would be glad to make sure a wagon carrying evidence against him never reaches the fort gates. We do this carefully, and we do it soon, because the road closes for winter within the month. And once the passes fill with snow, no judge, no cavalry patrol, and no truth is coming through until spring, and Gantry knows that as well as I do. Lavinia looked at this stranger who spoke of Gantry's schemes with the weary precision of a man who had already fought battles like this one, and she found herself asking the question she had been holding since the street. You said you had seen this trick worked on a family before, and that you did not stop it in time. What happened to them, Mr. Chandler? The forge was quiet a long moment. Outside, a wagon creaked past on the road, and somewhere down toward the river a meadowlark called out of season, confused by the warm afternoon sun that autumn sometimes granted before winter closed its fist. That is a longer story than we have daylight for today, Reuben said at last. I will tell it to you, Miss Holloway. I owe you at least that much honesty if we are going to trust each other with your brother's life and your land besides. But not today. Today I want to look at that notice again in my memory and write down every detail I can recall of the seal, because a forged seal always has some small flaw in it, and if I can name that flaw, we have the first thread to pull. Lavinia nodded, accepting the delay though she noted it, filing away the shape of a man who would rather admit a debt of honesty than pay it carelessly, and something about that carefulness settled a small, cautious trust into her chest where before there had only been fear. They did not solve the whole trouble that first afternoon, but they built the beginning of a plan, and when Lavinia and Peter rode the 3 miles back to their homestead as the sun dropped low and orange over the western bluffs, she found herself thinking less about Gantry's threats and more about the steadiness in Reuben Chandler's hands as he had sketched the false army seal from memory onto a scrap of paper. Getting the eagle's wing wrong on purpose, the first time just to prove to Peter how easy a small detail was to miss unless a man knew exactly what he was searching for. The days that followed took on a rhythm neither of them named as courtship, though it wore courtship's clothes plainly enough for anyone watching. 3 days after the standoff in the street, Lavinia's wagon threw a wheel on the rutted stretch of road just south of the crossing. The iron rim cracked clean through where old wood had finally given up its fight against seasons of frost and thaw. She had been hauling the last of her hay to trade at Merrow's store for salt and coffee, and the lamp oil that would have to see her and Peter through the coming dark months, and now she stood in the road with a broken wagon, a load of hay tilting dangerously, and the sun already sliding toward the hills. Reuben found her there an hour later, having ridden out on a hunch when she had not passed the forge by the time he expected. "You could have sent Peter for me," he said, already crouching to examine the shattered rim. "Peter is home, minding the stock. I did not think a broken wheel required an escort." A broken wheel on this stretch of road, 3 miles from Gantry's north fence, with the light going. Miss Holloway, I would call that exactly the kind of trouble that requires an escort. She wanted to argue out of pride, but the point stood too plainly to fight, and she found she did not mind his company nearly as much as she minded needing it. He worked with an economy of motion that she found herself watching more closely than the actual repair required. The way his hands turned the ruined rim in the fading light, testing the wood beneath for rot. The way he talked to her, all the while not out of nervous habit, but because he seemed genuinely curious about the answers. "Tell me about Bristol," he said, pulling a spare iron band from the toolbox lashed behind his saddle. "Why Bristol? Because you say the word like it still means something warm to you, even after everything that has happened since. Most folks who left the old country for this territory talk about where they came from like it was a debt they were glad to walk away from." Lavinia considered that, surprised he had noticed such a small thing in her voice. "My grandmother kept a garden behind our house in Bristol, roses mostly and herbs for cooking. I remember the smell of rosemary more clearly than I remember her face now, which frightens me some nights, if I am honest. My father wanted land of his own more than he wanted anything, because in England a man like him could work a lord's fields his whole life and own nothing at the end of it but calluses. Here, at least, the law says the land can be ours if we hold it and work it. I mean to see that promise kept, Mr. Chandler, whatever it costs me. Even if it costs you Gantry's good opinion." "Gantry's good opinion is not for sale at any price, since he has none to spare for a woman who will not sell him her water rights." Reuben laughed, a short surprised sound, as though laughter did not come easily to him, but this had caught him off guard enough to escape. "You remind me of somebody," he said, and then seemed to catch himself, the laughter fading into something more guarded. "Never mind. Hold that lamp a little higher for me if you would. I want to see this weld before it cools wrong." She held the lamp, and did not press him, though she noted the way his face had closed like a door when he mentioned whoever it was she reminded him of, and filed that away too, another small piece of the man she was slowly assembling in her mind like a puzzle whose full picture she was not yet permitted to see. By the time the wheel was sound enough to bear the weight of the hay wagon again, full dark had come down over the plains, and a wash of stars had opened up overhead thick enough to light their way. "I want to teach you something," Reuben said as they walked the horses the last stretch toward her homestead, the wagon creaking steady behind them. "Not because I think you cannot manage without it, but because a person who can shoe her own horse and fix her own wagon iron is a person who does not have to wait on anybody else's mercy to keep moving. I learned that lesson the hard way once, and I would rather teach it to you gently than have you learn it the way I did." "You keep alluding to some hard lesson, Mr. Chandler, without ever telling the story attached to it." "I know. I am not ready yet, but I will be before this is finished between us, because you have made it clear you require honesty before you will offer trust, and that is a fair requirement. I only ask you grant me the time to give it to you properly, and not in pieces dropped along the road like breadcrumbs." "That is fair," she said, and meant it, though the waiting cost her something she could not quite name, a hunger to understand this careful, capable man that had crept up on her faster than she had expected. They reached her homestead's fence line, and he helped her unhitch the team in companionable silence. And when Peter came out from the cabin with a lantern and 100 questions about the wheel repair, Reuben answered every one of them with a patience that made something in Lavinia's chest ache in a way she had not felt since before her father died. when the world had still contained the possibility of being cared for rather than only the necessity of caring for others. He did not stay for supper that night, though she offered, riding back toward the crossing under the wide autumn stars with the shape of her standing in her own doorway, lantern light behind her, fixed somewhere behind his ribs where he had not let anyone settle in a very long time. Over the next 2 weeks, the small acts accumulated the way snow accumulates before the first real storm, each flake unremarkable alone, the sum of them undeniable. Reuben rode out to the Holloway homestead on a morning heavy with frost, and mended the hinge on the barn door that had been dragging in the mud since before Lavinia's father died, and stayed to teach Peter how to true a wagon wheel on the shop's own jig, walking him through the geometry of it with a patience that made the boy stand a full inch taller by the time the lesson ended. Lavinia brought him a jar of her mother's rosemary, grown from seed she had carried across the ocean and nursed through 8 winters in a clay pot on her windowsill. And though the gift was small, Reuben held the jar like a man handling something considerably more valuable, and set it on the shelf above his own cot where he could smell it when the wind blew through the shop at night. She mended a shirt for him one evening, a task she had not offered but had simply done, noticing the sleeve seam had torn at the elbow, and when she handed it back to him folded and repaired, he had gone quiet in a way that made her worry she had overstepped some line, until he said, "Lo, nobody has mended anything of mine since my mother passed. I did not realize how much I had missed it." "Then I am glad to have reminded you," she said, and the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her then told her more than any speech could have. It was on one of those evenings, with the forge banked low and the first true chill of winter creeping in under the shop door, that he finally told her the story he had promised. "I was a wagon master," he began, without preamble, as though he had rehearsed the opening line so many times in his own head that he needed to say it quickly before his nerve failed him. 8 years of it, guiding families from the railheads out to their claims all across this territory and beyond, into Montana some seasons, down into Colorado others. I was good at it. I want you to understand that first, because what happened after does not erase the years before it. I never lost a soul in 8 years of guiding, not to river crossings, not to weather, not to raiders, not to sickness that a careful hand could have prevented. What happened, Reuben?" She used his given name for the first time, and he seemed to hear it, some tension in his shoulders easing slightly even as he pushed forward into the hardest part. 3 years ago, I was hired to guide a train of 11 wagons north out of Cheyenne, late in the season, later than I liked. But the families were desperate to reach their claims before winter, and the pay was good, and I let myself believe I could make up the lost time. There was a family among them, the Millers, a young husband and wife with a boy about 6 years old, sweet kid, used to follow me around camp asking questions about the stars. We hit an early blizzard in the high country, weeks before any storm like that had a right to arrive. I made the call to push through a mountain pass rather than wait it out in a valley camp, because I judged we had enough daylight and the families had enough supplies to risk it, and I was wrong. The Miller wagon slid on ice near the crest, went off the trail into a ravine. I got the husband and wife out. I did not get to the boy in time. Lavinia's hand found his across the workbench without her quite deciding to move it there. "It was not your hand that killed him," she said quietly. "It was ice and a mountain and a season that turned early. You cannot carry a mountain's cruelty on your own back, Reuben. I made the call to cross that pass. 10 other families trusted me to make the right calls, and I made the wrong one. And a boy who used to ask me about the stars is buried on a mountainside I have never gone back to visit because I cannot stand the thought of standing over that grave. I quit guiding trains within the month. I bought this forge with the last of my wages, and I have not led so much as a Sunday picnic since, because I promised myself I would never again hold that much responsibility for other people's lives in my 2 hands. and yet you drew a rifle on coal work in the middle of the street for a family you had never spoken a word to. That was different, was it? You took responsibility for what might happen to Peter, to me, the moment you stepped off that porch. You have been taking small pieces of responsibility for us ever since, one wagon wheel and one horseshoe lesson at a time, whether you have let yourself call it that or not. Reuben looked at her for a long moment, something raw and searching in his face, as though she had handed him back a piece of himself he had thrown away 3 years before, and he was not yet certain he was allowed to want it returned. "I am telling you all this," he said, "because you asked for honesty before trust, and because the road out of this territory closes within 3 weeks, once the passes fill, and there are families all up and down this crossing who are going to need a guide to reach the fort and the winter stores before that happens, families with children among them, and every fiber in me wants to refuse the asking when it comes, because I do not trust myself with that many lives again. But you are telling me this because the asking is going to come. It already has. Old Byron down at the store has been organizing 6 families to make the crossing to Fort Fetterman before the first heavy snow, on account of the road being the only safe route now that Gantry's men have been harassing anyone who tries the northern trail alone. He asked me to guide them. I told him I would think on it. And what have you thought?" "That I am afraid," Reuben admitted, the words costing him visibly, "and that being afraid has kept me safe and useless in equal measure for 3 years. And I do not know which fear is winning tonight, the fear of leading people again, or the fear of watching you and Peter fight Gantry alone, while I hide behind this anvil pretending I have no skills worth risking." Lavinia squeezed his hand and did not offer easy comfort, because she had learned already that this man did not want easy comfort. He wanted honest company in a hard place. "I cannot make that choice for you," she said. "But I can tell you that whatever you decide, the notice against Peter is still a lie, and Gantry is still circling our land like a wolf waiting for the fire to die down, and we are running out of days before the road closes and takes our chance at justice with it. Whatever guiding you choose to do or not do, I am riding to that fort before the first snow, with or without an escort, because I will not let my brother hang for a crime some greedy rancher invented to steal a spring." "Then you will not ride alone," Reuben said, something settling into decision behind his eyes even as the old fear still lived visibly beside it. "Whatever else I choose, I am not letting you make that ride without me beside you. That much I know for certain." It was not a declaration of love, not yet, not in words either of them would have named that way, but it felt like one to both of them all the same, a promise made across a cooling forge in the deep quiet of an autumn evening, 2 people who had each been carrying too much alone finally setting a portion of the weight down between them. The midpoint came 8 days later, on a morning when the frost had turned to a hard silver crust across every fence rail in the district. And it came the way disasters usually do, without any courtesy of warning. Lavinia woke before dawn to the smell of smoke and the sound of her dog barking fit to wake the dead, and when she ran out into the yard in her nightdress with her father's old shotgun in her hands, she found her hay barn, the whole winter's cut, already burning at one corner, flames climbing the dry timber faster than any bucket line could hope to fight. "Peter!" She screamed, and her brother came stumbling from the cabin half-dressed, and together they managed to save the horses and the milk cow, dragging the terrified animals clear of the barn even as the roof began to groan and shudder above them. But the hay itself, months of cutting and stacking and praying for a mild winter, was lost within the hour, a column of orange sparks rising into the gray pre-dawn sky. By the time the sun had fully risen, Lavinia stood in the ash-smelling yard staring at the collapsed ruin of the barn, and found, tucked under a stone at the edge of her own porch step, where whoever had done this wanted it plainly found, a folded paper. It was another notice, this one crude, unsigned, but the message was unmistakable. Sell now, or the next fire finds the cabin instead of the barn. Reuben arrived within the hour, having seen the smoke rise from the crossing and ridden hard the whole 3 miles, and found Lavinia sitting on the porch step with the threatening note in her lap and a look on her face that frightened him more than any tears would have. A stillness born of a woman calculating exactly how much more she could afford to lose before she had nothing left to fight with. "They have taken our winter feed," she said, when he knelt in front of her. "Without hay, we cannot keep the stock through the season. Without the stock, we have no claim worth holding come spring, even if Peter is cleared of every false charge Gantry has invented. This was never only about the horses, Reuben. This is about starving us off our own land before the snow even falls." "Then we do not wait any longer," Reuben said, his voice steady despite the anger burning behind his eyes. "I am done being careful. I am done letting fear of my own past keep me sitting behind that forge, while Gantry burns families out one barn at a time. I am guiding Byans crossing to Fort Fetterman, and I am bringing your case before the post commander myself, with every piece of evidence we can gather before we go, and I am not leaving your side until this is finished, one way or another. You cannot fix this alone, Reuben, any more than I can. I am not asking to fix it alone. I am asking you to trust me enough to fix it together, the way we have been circling toward doing for 2 weeks now without either of us saying it plain. Lavinia, I do not have hay to offer you, and I do not have the power to make Gantry disappear from this territory, but I have a forge full of iron, a rifle I know how to use, and 8 years of guiding wagons safely through worse country than the road to Fetterman. Let me put all of it to use for you." She looked at him a long moment, ash still smudging her cheek, grief for the burned barn still raw in her chest, and felt something steady settle into place beside that grief, a certainty that whatever came next, she would not be facing it with only her own 2 hands. "All right," she said. "Together, then. But we move quickly, because Gantry has shown us tonight exactly how far he is willing to go, and I do not intend to give him time to go further." They spent the following 4 days in a fever of preparation, and it was in that fever that the second thread of evidence finally came loose. Reuben rode to Fort Fetterman under cover of delivering iron as usual, and while there, struck up a conversation with a young corporal named Whitfield who kept the post's supply ledgers, a careful, bored young man glad of any company willing to talk horses with him. Over coffee in the sutler's store, Reuben learned that the 6 missing remounts had, in fact, turned up 3 weeks prior, sold at a stock auction in Cheyenne by a trader who had purchased them. So the trader claimed, from a rancher matching Silas Gantry's description, at a price well below their true army value. The kind of price a man accepts only when he wants a sale done quickly and quietly. The quartermaster never connected the horses recovered at that Cheyenne auction to our missing remounts, Whitfield admitted, lowering his voice though nobody else sat near enough to hear. The brands had been altered crudely, but altered enough that nobody looked twice at the paperwork. If somebody could bring me proof those were our horses, and proof of who sold them, I would carry that straight to the post commander myself. Major Thorpe does not tolerate theft from his own picket lines, and he tolerates false accusations against innocent civilians even less, if you can show him the notice naming young Holloway was never issued through proper channels. Reuben rode back to Larkspur Crossing with that thread clutched tight, and when he laid it before Lavinia in the forge that evening, something in her face broke open with hope for the first time in weeks. "If we can get a statement from that trader in Cheyenne confirming Gantry sold him those horses," she said, "and bring it before Major Thorpe alongside proof the notice against Peter was never properly filed, we could clear my brother's name entirely and turn the accusation back onto the man who invented it." "Cheyenne is a hard ride this late in the season," Reuben said. 4 days there and back if the weather holds, and we do not have 4 days to spare before Byans' families need to cross to the fort ahead of the first heavy snow. I have sent word to a man I trust in Cheyenne, an old friend from my guiding days who still does honest business at the stockyards. He will get that trader's statement in writing and write it up to us himself, but it will take time we may not have. Then we prepare the crossing to the fort while we wait, Lavinia said, and we bring Peter and the evidence we already have, and we trust that the rest will catch up to us before Gantry finds a way to silence it. It was a plan built on hope stacked atop hope, fragile as new ice, but it was the only plan available to them, and so they built toward it with everything they had left. The crossing was set to begin at first light on a morning 11 days before the road was expected to close for winter. 6 families in all, the Byans and the Kowalskis and the Larsons and 3 others besides, along with Lavinia and Peter and what remained of their salvaged stock, all bound together under Reuben Chandler's guidance for the 40-mile push north to Fort Fetterman, where they would winter under the fort's protection, and if fortune held, see Gantry's lies unraveled before the Army's own eyes. They made 18 miles the first day without incident, the wagons creaking in a long, careful line along the military road, children bundled against the cold, Reuben riding at the head of the column with the particular alert stillness of a man who had done this work 1,000 times and had never quite let himself trust it again until now. It was on the second day, with 22 miles behind them and 18 still ahead, that the wind shifted out of the southwest and brought with it the smell of smoke thick enough to taste. "Fire!" called old Byan from the second wagon, standing to peer at the horizon, and Reuben turned in his saddle to see a wall of orange light climbing the dry grass hills behind them, moving with a speed that stole the breath from his chest, because he had seen grass fires before, and he knew this one was already running faster than any wagon train could hope to outpace on the open road. "It is Gantry's doing," Lavinia said, pulling her own wagon up alongside Reuben's horse, her face pale in the strange amber light now spreading across the whole southern sky. "His men were seen near the dry coulee south of here yesterday. He means to trap us between the fire and the river crossing ahead, or drive us off the road entirely into country he controls. Whatever his intention, the fire does not care whose plan it is serving anymore," Reuben said, already turning his horse to ride the length of the column, shouting orders that carried the particular authority of a man who had, despite 3 years of self-imposed exile, never actually forgotten how to be exactly what these families needed him to be in this moment. "We cannot outrun it on the road. The wind is pushing it northeast, same direction we are traveling, which means it will catch the tail of this column before we reach the river unless we move faster than these wagons can safely go on this ground. There is a cut through the bluffs," Lavinia called out, memory of a hunting trip with her father surfacing sharp and sudden. 2 miles east, a dry wash that leads down to the river below the usual ford. It is rough ground, but it is rock and gravel mostly, nothing left for the fire to feed on. If we can turn the column that way, we might reach the river ahead of the flame front and use the water itself as a barrier." "Show me," Reuben said, and she did not hesitate, turning her own wagon off the road with a confidence that surprised even her own brother, who scrambled to keep the milk cow moving at her heels. What followed was the hardest hour any of them would ever live through. Reuben rode the length of the column again and again, calming a Kowalski horse that had begun to rear in terror at the smell of smoke, helping the Larson family lash down a wagon wheel that threatened to work loose on the rough ground, always circling back to check the pace, the fire's advance, the position of the sun now blotted orange-red behind curtains of drifting ash. The heat came first, a wave of it rolling ahead of the visible flame, dry and stinging, and then the light itself changed, the whole world gone the color of a dying coal, and the fire's roar became audible even over the terrified screaming of horses and the frightened crying of the youngest Byan children clinging to their mother in the back of the family wagon. "We are not going to make the wash in time on this pace," Reuben shouted to Lavinia, riding alongside her wagon as the flame front visibly closed the distance behind them, a wall of light now clearly gaining on the rearmost wagons. I need every family to cut loose anything they can spare, feed sacks, spare lumber, anything that slows the wagons, and I need the strongest horses moved to pull the weakest teams if any animal falters. You are asking families to abandon their supplies for winter. I am asking them to survive tonight so there is a winter left to worry about supplies for. Lavinia, I need your help getting that message down the line faster than I can carry it alone. You know these families now as well as I do. They will hear it from you with less panic than they will from a stranger shouting orders. She did not hesitate, turning her own horse to ride the opposite direction down the column. And for the next brutal quarter hour, the two of them worked the length of that terrified train together, one from each end, meeting in the middle and parting again, until every wagon had shed what weight it could, and every team was pulling at its absolute limit toward the dry wash now visible ahead, as a darker seam cut into the orange-lit bluffs. It was young Nils Larson, only 7 years old, who nearly cost them everything, slipping from the back of his family's wagon in the chaos and confusion, disoriented by smoke, wandering the wrong direction, toward the fire rather than away from it. And it was Reuben who saw him first, a small shape stumbling through drifting ash not 40 yards from where the flame front itself was already licking up through dry sage. He did not think. He turned his horse and rode straight toward the fire, leaning low from the saddle to scoop the screaming boy up against his chest, and for one terrible instant, wheeling the horse back toward the column with heat scorching his own back through his shirt, Reuben Chandler relived, whole and complete, the exact frozen horror of a mountain past 3 years gone, a boy's small weight, a decision made in half a second that would either save a life or cost one. This time his hands did not fail. He rode clear of the flame's reach with Nils Larson sobbing but unhurt against his chest, and delivered the boy back into his mother's arms at the mouth of the dry wash, and something inside Reuben that had been frozen solid for 3 years finally, fully, broke loose and ran free, grief transforming at last into something closer to grace. Lavinia saw the whole thing from 40 yards distant, saw him ride into the very teeth of the fire without a heartbeat's hesitation for a child that was not his own blood, and felt her heart seize with terror. And then, as he emerged safe with the boy alive in his arms, filled with something so large and fierce it left her breathless in the saddle. The column reached the river an hour before the fire itself arrived at the bluffs above, and there, on the wide gravel bar where the water ran shallow and fast, 6 families and 1 blacksmith who had once been a wagon master stood together and watched the flame front reach the water's edge, and denied fuel, denied passage, gutter and check, and finally turn aside to burn itself out along the dry hills to the east instead. Nobody spoke for a long while, all of them simply breathing the cooler air rising off the river, watching the terrible, beautiful light of the dying fire paint the water gold and red. "You saved that boy," Lavinia said finally, finding Reuben standing a little apart from the others, staring at the retreating fire with an expression she could not entirely read. "I almost did not reach him in time," Reuben said quietly. "For one moment out there I was back on that mountain pass, certain I was about to fail exactly the same way again. But you did not fail. You reached him, Reuben. You brought him home." "I did." He turned to look at her, and in the firelight his face held something new, a kind of stunned, grateful wonder, as though a debt he had believed permanently unpaid had suddenly, impossibly, been settled. "I have spent 3 years believing myself unfit to be trusted with anyone's safety again, and tonight, when it mattered most, my hands did not shake, my judgment did not fail, and a boy who could have died is sleeping safe in his mother's arms instead because I did the thing I trained a lifetime to do. I do not know how to hold that feeling yet, Lavinia. It is bigger than I expected forgiveness to feel." "Then let me help you hold it," she said, and closed the distance between them. And when he wrapped his arms around her there on the gravel bar with the fire dying red behind them, and the whole cold autumn sky wheeling bright with stars overhead, neither of them pulled away. "I love you," Reuben said into her hair, the words arriving with none of the careful hesitance that had marked every other admission he had made her over the past weeks, arriving instead like something finally, simply true. "I have loved you since you stood in that street with a rifle steadier than my own hands, and I have been too much a coward about my own past to say it plainly until now." "I love you too," Lavinia answered, and felt the words settle into her chest with a rightness that silenced, at last, the small, cautious voice that had guarded her heart so carefully since her father's death. "I required honesty of you before I would offer trust, Reuben Chandler, and you have given me more honesty than I ever thought to ask for. I do not intend to waste what has grown between us being afraid of it any longer." They stood together a long while on that gravel bar, the fire settling to embers along the eastern hills, the families around them slowly finding rest where they could among the wagons, and when at last they walked back to help settle the camp for what remained of the night, they walked with their hands joined, and neither of them let go. The column reached Fort Fetterman 2 days later, weary, ash-streaked, but whole, every family accounted for, every child safe, and it was there, within the log walls of the fort itself, that the last thread of Gantry's scheme finally came apart. Reuben's friend from Cheyenne arrived at the fort within the same week, carrying a signed and witnessed statement from the stock trader, confirming the sale of 6 horses bearing the fort's altered brand, purchased directly from Silas Gantry 3 weeks prior, along with a bill of sale bearing Gantry's own signature, careless and confident, a man who had never imagined his crime would be traced back so precisely. Major Ellery Thorpe, a broad, gray-mustached officer with little patience for either false accusations or theft from his own picket lines, received the evidence in his office with a stony, deliberate calm that Lavinia found more reassuring than any dramatic outrage could have been. "This notice naming Peter Holloway," Thorpe said, turning the crudely printed paper over in his hands, "was never filed through this post's provost office. I can confirm that myself, as I recall no such document crossing my desk, and my clerk keeps meticulous records. Whoever printed this did so to frighten, not to prosecute, which is itself a crime under territorial law, quite apart from the theft this evidence now clearly lays at Mr. Gantry's door." "What happens now, Major?" Peter asked, standing straighter than Lavinia had seen him stand in weeks, the weight of false accusation finally lifting visibly from his shoulders. "Now I dispatch a detail to bring Mr. Gantry in for formal questioning regarding the theft of Army property and the issuance of a fraudulent legal notice, both serious charges in this territory, whatever his standing among the local ranchers. And I will personally see to it that a written record clearing your name, young man, is filed and copied to the land office, so that no further claim of abandonment or ill conduct can be brought against your family's homestead on the strength of this false accusation." It took 4 more days for the detail to ride out and return with Silas Gantry in custody, along with Cole Rourke, who, faced with the evidence and the certainty of a longer sentence should he protect his employer further, gave a full account of the barn burning and the false notice both, laying every piece of the scheme at Gantry's feet in exchange for leniency of his own. Lavinia stood on the fort's parade ground the morning the detail rode in with Gantry under guard, and watched the man who had threatened to burn her out of the only home she had known since leaving Bristol pass by on horseback, hands bound, face gray with the particular fury of a man watching his own greed collapse in on him. He looked at her once hard and said nothing, because there was nothing left for him to say that would carry any weight, and Lavinia found she felt no triumph in the moment, only a quiet, settled relief, the closing of a door that had been rattling open in the wind for far too long. "It is finished," Reuben said, standing beside her, his hand finding hers without either of them needing to speak the reaching. "Not entirely," she said. "The barn is still ash, the hay is still gone, the land is still there waiting for us to rebuild it, and winter is closer than any of us would like. Then we rebuild it, he said simply, as though the matter required no further debate. Together, if you will have me alongside you, and not only for one season. She turned to look at him, this man who had walked into fire for a stranger's child, who had carried 3 years of grief into a forge and come out the other side of it braver rather than smaller, and felt the last of her guarded caution finally, fully, let go. "What are you asking me, Reuben Chandler?" "I am asking you to stay," he said. "Though I know it is your own land you would be staying on, and your own claim you built with your own family's hands. So perhaps it is I who ought to be asking to stay with you, if you will let me bring my forge along and set it up wherever you will have it. I do not want to guide one final crossing and disappear back behind an anvil, pretending the world has no further use for me. I want to build something that lasts, with you, on that land your father worked so hard to hold. And I want every family that travels this road in seasons to come to know they can count on a blacksmith and a farmer both standing ready to help them through whatever crossing they are making, the way you and I helped each other through this one. That is a great deal to ask of a woman you have known only 6 weeks. It is everything I have to offer, offered honestly, which I understood was the price of your trust from the very first day we met in that street." Lavinia laughed then, a sound bright with relief and joy both, and reached up to touch the scar through his eyebrow, the mark she had noticed the very first time she had looked at him fully. "Then yes," she said, "stay. Build your forge on Holloway land, and help me raise a new barn before the heaviest snow falls, and guide whatever families need guiding come every spring and autumn after this one. Because I have watched you become exactly the man you were always meant to be, Reuben, and I do not intend to let you disappear back behind that anvil ever again." They were married 3 weeks later, in the small chapel that served both the fort and the growing settlement around it, on a bright cold morning, with the first true snow of the season dusting the ground outside the chapel door, Peter standing as witness, alongside old Bion and the Larson family, and half a dozen others whose safe crossing Reuben had guided through fire only weeks before. All of them crowded warm and laughing into the small building to see the wagon master and the farmer's daughter bound together at last. Lavinia wore her mother's shawl, carried across the ocean from Bristol 8 years before, and carried also a small sprig of rosemary from the plant that had survived every winter since, tucked into the collar of her dress. And when Reuben Chandler said his vows to her, his voice steady and sure in a way it had not been steady in 3 long years, she felt the whole cold, beautiful morning settle warm around her heart. They rebuilt the barn together before the first heavy snow closed the road for the season, Reuben's forge skills making short work of the iron fittings, half the settlement turning out to help raise the timber frame in a single long, cheerful day of hammering and singing, and shared food that felt, to Lavinia, like the truest kind of homecoming she had known since her family first broke ground on that land 9 years before. Reuben set his forge up in a new linta built against the side of the rebuilt barn, close enough to the cabin that Lavinia could hear the ring of his hammer while she worked in her kitchen, a sound she came to love the way she had once loved the smell of rosemary in her grandmother's Bristol garden, something warm and constant that meant home. And when the spring thaw came at last, and the military road opened again for the season's first travelers, it was Reuben Chandler, wagon master once more, who rode out at the head of a new column of families bound for their own claims further west, with Lavinia Holloway Chandler riding beside him as far as the fork in the road before turning back toward the farm they were building together, confident in the knowledge that whatever crossing still lay ahead for either of them, they would face them no longer alone, but together, exactly as they had promised each other on that gravel bar beneath the dying light of a wildfire that had, in the end, burned away far more fear than it had ever destroyed.